The hearing of the Committee on Financial Services will come to order. This is the second hearing we will be having for the Committee on the question of the government-sponsored enterprises. The chairman of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, Mr. Kandrowski, had a very useful hearing on this on Monday, and we hope to be voting on this bill in committee before the break. And I think we set it for March 28th, and we then hope to be able to go to the floor. So that is where we are. We have been working on this bill for some time. A version of this bill that is quite close to the bill that's before us passed this committee by a very large majority and the House by a large majority in the previous Congress. It was largely bipartisan. There were some points of difference. I will note that a couple of the points of difference then have been specifically addressed in the, not in the existence of the housing fund, but how it is administered and how it is in fact calculated. There have been some other changes as well as conversations that I had with some consultation with the minority, but I don't claim that they have the full responsibility for this, but we did try to stay in touch with people. And this was in December, so it was still when Mr. Oxley was the outgoing chairman. And we had conversations with the Treasury Department, with various people. Deputy Secretary Steele was, Undersecretary Steele was very important in that. And we have the bill before us. The bill does several things that seem to us important. First of all, it substantially enhances the power of the regulator. I do want to say that I think there has been a somewhat excessive debate over exactly what the powers of the regulator are. We currently have a regulatory structure that most of us agree gives the regulator less legal authority than he ought to have. Despite that, in the past few months, the regulator has ordered both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to do things that they didn't want to do on their own, because nobody ever has to order anybody to do what they want to do, except in circumstances which it would be inappropriate to discuss here. The fact is that even with the acknowledged less than full authority, both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac complied. And I think we ought to recognize that if you have a regulator and he has powers and he is determined to do something, he's probably going to be able to do that. We can set a framework and set some guidelines. Here are the guidelines that I want to set in the bill, and I think the bill does this. Look, there are people who believe, as a matter of economic philosophy, that it is a mistake to interfere with the allocative function of the capital market by giving a preference to housing and particularly home ownership. That's a legitimate philosophical debate. By creating and continuing the GSEs, which get a certain advantage when they borrow in the marketplace because of arrangements that exist, and even more important, because of perceptions about those arrangements, including some misperceptions. But I do not feel, I try not to promulgate misperceptions, but I have no objection to benefiting from other people's misperceptions as long as their existence was not my fault. And I think that's where we are to some extent with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I believe the misperceptions are sufficiently deeply rooted that it will not shake them by so designating them. But that does give a preference in the capital market for housing, home ownership, but also rental housing, as we will get into. And I understand there are people who are philosophically opposed to it. I believe some of the debate that happened last year and before came between people who shared the philosophical view that it was a mistake to have the allocative function of the capital market interfered with, and those of us who said, no, we like having this preference for housing. Then the question becomes, okay, if you agree that it is legitimate to maintain the preference for housing, two sets of questions come up. Is there sufficient power in the regulator to make sure that as you go forward with this system, you don't run into problems within these two entities that could cause broader problems, safety and soundness issues? I believe in this bill, and I know the former chairman, Mr. Oxley, agreed with this. We believe strongly that the bill we had last year gave the regulator full power to deal with any safety and soundness issue, whether by raising the capital or reducing the portfolio or other means. Subsequent to that bill being passed, when Mr. Oxley agreed, as I did, that we had reached that level, we've somewhat enhanced the power of the regulator. And so I do not think there is any room for doubt that the regulator has full powers under this bill to do what needs to be done for safety and soundness. We did disagree that there should be a power to deal with something defined as systemic risk over and above safety and soundness. I will confess to being very skeptical that you could have entities that caused risks to the system when they themselves had no problems. It would be sort of, I'm trying to envision Samson in the temple pulling down the walls and not getting hit in the head. I don't think that you can destroy the entity and escape any damage yourself. We will discuss this. I have to say that this is an atmosphere of sun sensitivity, and I would hope that we would get agreement, not just on the language of this bill, but agreement, frankly, among us, including the people here, as to what that means and how it will be interpreted, because you can never write everything exactly. And I think some common understanding of what we mean by this and the areas I'm talking about. Full powers over safety and soundness, but not reaching the philosophical debate or and I think the philosophical debate gets into a systemic risk issue. Secondly, there is the question of housing, and I will give myself an additional 2 minutes, and then I'll pass it on to the minority. One of the arguments that has been made for change is that Fannie and Freddie get the benefits that I talked about from the perception or misperception by the financial community, and too many of those benefits remain with the stockholders of Fannie and Freddie, and in past times with even the CEOs of Fannie and Freddie, although stay tuned for the executive compensation legislation. We may deal with that in a broader sense. But I agree, Fannie and Freddie, past executives, not current ones, there was an abusive compensation practice, but there was also an argument, I share, too much of the money was being held for Fannie and Freddie's benefit, not enough being shared with the public purpose. Well, there are two things you can do if you feel that. You can reduce what Fannie and Freddie are able to accumulate by cutting back on the portfolio or other ways, or you can allow them to continue that level, depending on how they fare in the market, but require them to share more of it with the public purpose. That's what we chose in the bill last year, and we choose again in the bill that's now pending. And that's the creation of the housing fund. And I know, and let me be clear, Fannie and Freddie have goals, and those goals are to help affordable housing. Affordable housing, as people who cover housing know technically, has several subcategories. Affordable housing used to be, for the goals, housing aimed at people at 100% median. At the suggestion of people at the Financial Roundtable, in particular our former colleague here, Mr. Bartlett, we said, no, that's not consistent. We generally say affordable housing has to be aimed at people at 80% of median or below. We changed that in the bill to 80%. But you cannot get much below people who are at 80% of median simply by the secondary market by buying loans. If you're going to reach people who are at low income, 50%, extremely low income, 30% of median and below, then there has to be an element of subsidy. You cannot do it just by loans. And that's the distinction that some people fail to understand. This bill does enhance the goals. It does try to push Fannie and Freddie. It will push Fannie and Freddie into doing more in the 80% range. But nothing you can do with loans and repurchase of loans and securitization of mortgages reaches that low level. We then say, yes, we agree that they are keeping more of the benefit than they should. We take a small part of that benefit and put it in the housing fund. And I have to say here that some of my friends on the conservative side seem to me to be inconsistent. On the one hand, they are advocating very tough regulation for Fannie and Freddie, unlike any other private entity, because they have this government-sponsored enterprise element. So when it comes to regulating them, telling them how much capital they can have, what they can hold in their portfolio, what, in fact, activities they can engage in, they are public entities to be regulated. When it then comes to how you deal with the profits they amass, all of a sudden they become private property, no trespassing, you'll be electrocuted if you come on the land. They can't be both. They can't be wholly government-sponsored for the purposes of regulating them and setting their capital standards, et cetera, but then private enterprise, you can't take the money. We think that they are a mix and that reasonable activity is permissible in both cases. That's what this bill does. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, and the gentleman from Alabama has used the power under the rule here, which we agreed to take an additional 10 minutes. So he has 20 minutes, I believe, of 20. The gentleman is entitled to 20 minutes of opening statements. And I realize this is a lot for you all to sit and listen to, but this is an important bill, and I do think it's important that we air these things. And, you know, I assume you were all smart enough to figure the morning was killed anyway, so not a problem if you have to sit and listen to it. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.